Hello and welcome to NUS Now. I'm Daniel Farris,
And I'm Amy Graham.
and today we're going to be discussing the decarbonisation of your supply chains and how data quality can affect that. But first of all, we're going to start with the news and everything that's happened throughout February and early March. So, Amy, I've heard a lot about the news recently regarding the Environment Agency's water reporting for data centres. Please, can you expand upon that a bit?
Yes, so as many people are probably aware, data centers are very high users of water. In fact, it's quite a small number of data centers are particularly high users. So this has led to issues with supply, but also issues within the local environment. So the Environmental Agency is looking to align with EED reporting across Europe and to put in place a similar framework for water reporting, specifically for the UK and for data centres. So this will be requiring reporting on water use, water efficiency, and then also for developers to actually work with the water suppliers to ensure they're not doing any harmful overuse and to monitor how it's going to work with the suppliers.
Yeah, so it is actually a big concern because a lot of organisations at the moment are, quite worried about their water consumption in some respects because they have a lot more control over it. And really, when looking at that scope 3 aspects, they want to make sure that they can minimise it as much as possible and don't want to feel like all of the efforts they're making are being made for nothing when other organisations might be using a lot more, and obviously with that associated carbon impact are being a lot more polluting to the environment. But there aren't really that many regulations relating to water reporting currently in the UK, are there?
No, so currently a large proportion of the regulations in relation to the environment are carbon or biodiversity related. One that really stands out is SECR or the new SRS reporting regulations that were released at the end of last month. But this regulation will change that. It will start to put pressure on some of the highest water consumers to really monitor their consumption and start to be more efficient with it. And it will also look to change the source of water, as currently you can only really use potable drinking water effectively for cooling. So it will also look to see if there are other sources of water, such as sewage effluent, that may actually also be appropriate, which will then reduce the strains on freshwater supplies.
Yes, and we were speaking to a vast number of data centres recently who were discussing the opportunity of using river water and the sort of restrictions that can come about with that. One of them they mentioned was that they wanted to take the river water out and then dump it back in, but the problem with that is obviously the heating that's associated with it, and then obviously when putting it back in, the sort of algal growth, for example, the effect it might have on fish, etc.
Yeah, so you do have to be very careful with taking from the local environment. So you don't really want to affect too much the river discharge. This can impact the flow of the river and the erosion rate of the riverbed, as well as it can impact water sources downstream. So while they might be taking it from a riverbed here, thinking it's not too big of a concern, that could reduce dam capacity later down the line. But also, yeah, as you said, dumping the used water back in can then pollute a source of fresh water, which is definitely something that we don't want to be seen happening.
Of course. Now, there has been some news in that's come about recently that in sort of early February there was a release from the South Australia government around their power prices plummeting. And I think it would be a really good point to actually to touch on for this because it's very much a good news story. A lot of the time when we report, it can be that it's very much a doom and gloom scenario, especially when you're looking, globally at all of the efforts. But this one's really positive that towards the end in Q4 of 2025, South Australia managed to nearly get their fuel supply towards 100% renewable. And what that actually led to was a 30% reduction in the wholesale price of electricity when comparing it to Q4 2024. And in some cases, actually, it brought the price down to a negative.
Yeah.
I think this is really important to highlight because they primarily use solar and wind generation, which a lot of people are quite skeptical about in some situations because they often talk about if the sun doesn't shine, if the wind doesn't blow, nothing can come about. But what this has actually proved, I think, is that it's very much possible that this technology can work. You know, Victoria's second in line to them in terms of their solar, wind, and other renewable generation, but also the use of things like mega batteries too.
Yeah.
They are what can be used not only for rainy days, for cloudy days, for any other situation in which that, you know, they say the wind won't blow, the sun won't shine, but it's also really useful for price stability as well.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's definitely a really good point, because I think one of the things that companies often try and avoid is battery storage, because it looks really expensive, but you're realistically not going to be able to get a long-term renewable strategy without batteries. In Australia, obviously, people could start criticising it as a positive news story if they were to say, well, actually, that's one climate, that might not be transferable over here. But if you start to put in batteries, then it really can be transferable to any climate across the world, as there's always some form of nature. If it's less sunny, it's probably more windy, and we can then capture the storage and use that in the times where we might not be making as much of those nature-based renewable energy.
Of course. And when we're talking and using that it minimises that export as well. So your effective revenue coming from this is almost greater, and you can start using it with some schemes as well. So there's one scheme which has just opened up in the UK where you can start selling back your electricity, but now through select providers to the wholesale market, which really is groundbreaking in many respects. A lot of people are expected to go through their suppliers. You know, they'll get something around about 5 pence per kilowatt hour in that sort of region, but this ups it massively up towards that 10 to 12 pence per kilowatt hour, and the effective savings, the return on investment becomes a lot more attractive, not just to the financial people, but as well to the sustainability departments who might be concerned about that aspect and how they're going to prove the case to the rest of the business that this actually should be input, even though it might cost a lot of money. A lot of the technologies and the battery work that goes on, this positive story about using renewables and batteries can actually relate obviously to wider field, not just the central generation that goes into the grid, but also potentially for consumers who are looking for implementation on site. And there's been something in the news recently around the EU relating to their reduction targets. And I don't know if you just want to speak on that a bit further.
Yeah, so the EU have now implemented and bound fully into law their 2040 emissions reduction target of a 90% reduction. So this is an interim target en route to their carbon neutrality or net zero by 2050 target. That depends on which market you are in, and it advances on their previous 55% reduction by 2030. So this is definitely a really good way to link these together, as having the improved technology will really support them in enabling them to achieve the significant amount of reduction that they'll need to start seeing over the next 10, 15 years in order to meet those targets. As well, some offsets will be allowed. It won't be constant.
Of course. And do you think it's potentially a bit ambitious to go for 2040 rather than maybe something like 2045, which could potentially be a bit more manageable?
To an extent, but I think that's why they have got a bit more flexibility on the offsetting allowed. So it's a smaller amount allowed internationally with a little bit more allowed internally. So in practice, they'll possibly only really need to be seeing an 85% reduction rather than a full 90% reduction of all emissions, with some offset element, but that percentage is kind of consistent with the net zero standards, where typically best practice would be looking at 90% reduction with the remainder offset. But also I think having a more stringent target is actually going to be quite important. As you may have seen in the news, there is new climate science coming out with increased rates of warming, and we really do want to be doing everything we can to reduce that as soon as possible. So I don't know if you've seen the latest report that was released just at the weekend showing a doubling of the warming levels than previous decades.
Yes, and it's quite stark. You talked about it just there, that doubling aspect where global warming is taking place, and this warming of the Earth is taking place twice as fast. Originally, it was measured back in 2013, 2014 as being 0.18 degrees Celsius warming. However, and per year, and what we're now looking at is 0.36 degrees Celsius warming for the most recent period that we've looked at. And this is really important for multiple reasons. So the Paris Agreement, which was set up at COP21, focused largely on that 2 degrees limiting of increase in temperature from pre-industrial levels. When they're talking about pre-industrial, they're talking about 1850 to 1900 years. And they're wanting to make it more ambitious and say, okay, actually, maybe the 2% can be achieved, but we want people to push for that 1.5 degrees instead. And what they found with this is this increased warming might inadvertently lead us to exceeding that 1.5 degree target as soon as 2028.
No, that's quite terrifying, because obviously previously people are talking about trying to not exceed this until the end of the century, or at worst, like maybe they might see a bit of they might see that we would exceed it mid-century, maybe see some overshoot that will be come back down with either offset or the carbon capture technologies and elements such as that. However, seeing it come through at potentially reaching that level of warming in just a few years' time, we don't actually have the technology in place as of currently to really fight back against that if we do start to exceed the warming targets.
And this is really highlighting the fact that climate science is really complicated, that there are multiple different factors that take into account for this. In the paper themselves and around other reporting, they mention impacts such as El Nino and La Nina, that's the Pacific Ocean warming, and also some of the policy changes that have actually come about as well when it comes to shipping regulations and the removal of sulfur dioxide emissions, which on the surface of it is great and it's a very positive news story, but inadvertently that in itself has also caused a tiny bit of warming because the aerosols are no longer there and they would typically reflect a lot of the heat. So I think when it comes to trying to still meet those targets, business is going to have to work a lot harder, governments are going to have to work a lot harder, and obviously the general public as well. A lot of pressure will be put across everybody, and ultimately, sure, we may exceed it, but the hope is obviously with better removal technologies, with the increased uptake of renewable technologies as well, potentially there is still some scope, maybe some hope, that we can limit it. And as you mentioned, with the EU and that 90% target, maybe regulations will be put in place and it will actually improve our prospects.
Yeah, definitely. It's almost at a point where actually being ambitious but within a reasonable margin where it's possible will always be beneficial.
And for any other news that might be of interest, we publish our sustainability and industry news reports every single month. This month we've talked about matters to do with land sector guidance that's been released, the New York Climate Bill, as well as the SRS as well, which we'll be getting deeper into later on this month, whether it be by blogs or either discussions and meetings. So please look out for that and watch our channel and our page. But now to talk about the sort of meat and bones of today, which will be decarbonising your supply chain, as well as looking at the data quality aspect of what as well, and why that's important. And I think that's probably a good place to start. So Amy, would you mind just telling me, what really is data quality?
So data quality, that's quite a complex idea, but for basics, it's just having the best quality, most granular data you can physically get. So this would be looking at getting specific product level data rather than using financial data or averages to really break it down. But also it's trying to get it more as personalized as possible, which is not always there. And it's just making sure that there's no estimations or as few estimations as physically possible in your carbon footprint, because at the end of the day, you're using your carbon footprint to inform you where your emissions sit and where you need to start decarbonising. So if there are any estimations which may or may not be inflating your footprint, this can really push aside where you really need to focus. So as you're using this footprint for your decision making, it does really need to be as high quality as possible.
And as you mentioned, within there's sort of different forms of data quality. How do you describe as the most complete data quality? Would you say it's having the invoice, or would you say it's having, say, the meter data, which can align with the invoice, but it can better inform you on a lot of this sort of stuff?
So the most granular the piece of data, that's going to be the highest quality data, as long as you've got it from a reliable source. But if you are looking at half-hourly meter data, whereas your suppliers looked at the half-hourly meter data and given you a summary, realistically they should both be identical, but having the exact meter data might be a bit more reliable. There is, however, in this situation, a balance between getting the granularity of the data and making the data quite usable, as if we're looking at a few meters per site, hundreds of sites across a portfolio, we can't really be looking at every single half-hourly data point because that would take a lot of time. So if you've got a supplier invoice data in which the supplier has previously looked through all your half-hourly data or done your meter reads themselves, which are both source data points in themselves, which are really reliable, then the toss-up between getting that more granularity and having usable data, we would push towards the more usable data in that situation. But obviously, if you've got usable data that is not as high quality, we would be looking to go towards the more granularity.
And as you mentioned, within that, all of these different data sources, you can't be checking every single meter manually, especially. What we really are looking, I suppose, on the grander scheme of things, is people to look at energy information systems in which it consolidates all of this information out there, which there are plenty of different ones out there. And a lot of this is going to be required really for stuff like compliance. When it comes to, as we were discussing a bit in the news, on the Scope 1 and 2 aspect, we're seeing a lot more legislation out there, not just locally, but obviously internationally as well, where there's a large focus on Scope 1 and 2, where a lot of people feel they have a lot more control over it because, for example, with invoices, they come about. And also, you can make more informed recommendations off the back of it if you have greater data quality. Yeah. I was wondering, when it comes to those Scope 1 and 2 aspects, what are the difficulties that people tend to run into when they try to complete that initial profile of their emissions?
So I'd say there's two areas of difficulty for your average client Scope 1 and 2. So The first area is looking at landlord sites. So where you actually don't really have control, you might technically come under the operational control boundary, but you're not making the purchase of the electricity, so you don't have control over whether it's a green supply. If you're in a landlord held site where you have your utilities incorporated into your rent, you might just have this as a financial value provided to you, or even more like difficult to navigate, you might have one rental fee which includes your building rent, cleaning fees, water, gas, electricity, everything in one go. So that can be quite hard to section out each element. Of course, this would be where, to improve your data quality, we would suggest reaching out to your landlords to get the information, because they should have this available for you. If it's one large building with multiple clients in, they may need to put in place the potential sub-metering or data apportionment systems to enable them to provide you with that information. But so landlord supplies are typically somewhere which might need a bit more research from the client before they can just put in their invoice data. And then additionally, the category of fugitive emissions is a particularly challenging part of Scope 1 and 2. This is the release of refrigerants, often from air conditioning systems. It can be a small amount from refrigerators and such. But what we'd be looking to collect is any maintenance information, but not every company has information on their air conditioning and on their refrigerants. So typically this does seem to be benchmarked for across a lot of client bases, and that can be quite challenging as a lot of refrigerants have got a very high global warming potential. So if this is benchmarked to conservatively, this can relatively inflate a footprint, whereas if somebody looks to actually collect the appropriate data, this would be much more accurate, but also be much more manageable, because you can year on year work to reduce the issues. Whereas if you're estimating it, then the estimation methodology will remain the same regardless of how your air conditioning is functioning.
Yeah, and when we're looking at that aspect of, collecting all of these different maintenance records, speaking to your landlord, I think people tend to take data a tiny bit for granted. They don't necessarily sometimes see what such a large impact this can have when you're needlessly estimating for a site in which you don't have the maintenance records. Then, as you mentioned, your emissions will go up rather, unjustifiably in some circumstances, because nothing's actually had to be refilled or anything in that respect. So I think when we're talking about this, it's all actually extra effort and extra work. And if you're working in finance, for example, and everything that you're looking at has extremely large error bars, then you can't really make too much of an inference onto what to do and what the next step should be. So when we're talking about the need for this data, it's a lot of extra work, and it's also going to be important when it comes to your decarbonisation footprints. I mean, as I'm sure you know, everything would be so much simpler if every business had sub-meter data for their production lines, and if everybody actually had a fully quantified Scope 1 and 2 because of the Scope 3 impacts this would have.
Yeah, no, there's definitely so many areas where if companies were expected to have Scope 1 and 2, it would impact the downstream supply chain in a really positive manner. Lots of companies are being expected to report Scope 3, whether they are SBTI aligned or if they are government suppliers, they have to do a CRP, which includes some elements of Scope 3. And then further to that, we're looking into the EU, and you have compliance such as CBAM, which really needs to have specific product level, not even just Scope 1 and 2, but product level data coming from a installation in order to use that in your CBAM calculations. Otherwise, you have to use a default value which has been inflated to ensure that no emissions are missed out. So if your supplier is on the average end, but you have to use default, they will be looking at the worst possible case scenario just because they can't take any chances. So there's definitely so many places where having a sub-metering system and being able to fully calculate your scope 1 and 2, and if necessary, any specific product level emissions, can really support with going into supply chain emission calculations.
And that really means that you start to have to work with your suppliers more rather than using them as a tool which you can get everything from and sort of not look backwards. I think we're going to start seeing a lot of supplier outreach, suppliers, looking to install specific technologies purely so they can keep the business that they have. Because if you are up against other suppliers in the same market and one of them says to you, one of them says to the client, I have this specific data and I can show you that it's X amounts of carbon, and the other one says we don't know. And then, as you mentioned, you go to do your CBAM declarations. You don't end up having the best quality data for your current supplier. You end up having to pay more. And in terms of a business case, it'd be difficult to try and swing that the other way potentially. And maybe it works on a recommendation basis then. If you work with someone that you know can do the work, you can then start providing them the recommendations up the supply chain. And ultimately, that benefits the financial side, but also the decarbonisation side in the long run looking forward.
So we are actually seeing RFPs now including questions as to whether there's carbon data available. So yeah, that's definitely something that we'll be starting to see companies impacted by. Of course, if you are a long-standing supplier with someone, your client may not wish to swap suppliers if that's the only element where they failed the RFP essentially, in which companies would be more than welcome to obviously refer their suppliers to whichever partners they use for creating greenhouse gas assessments and creating the relevant data to ensure this goes up and down their supply chain correctly. But you are definitely correct in that if companies don't start to calculate their data appropriately, they may start to see business losses through RFPs if they're missing this vital information.
And do you think it would have a bit of a resistive effect where they're reaching out to their suppliers and saying, we need you to do this, and then unilaterally they'll say no? Or do you think there will, especially in the more carbon intensive market, be a lot more give and actually a bit more of a promotion to say, yes, we'll do this because we are aware that this is a spot in the market which no one else in our sector is potentially doing, and we know we can get a competitive advantage?
I think you definitely hit on something there talking about the carbon intensive market. So it may not be specifically a carbon intensive market, but I think it will really be market dependent. I think in the EU, then there will be quite a lot of flexibility around this. It was probably already quite popular to be demanding this or be expecting this from suppliers. Again, even within the EU, it depends on the country. But there will be potentially some markets where it will be a bit more of a challenge to request if you are the first company that requests it. If there are a few international companies or a few companies within that market that start to push, and companies who were originally resistant have realised, oh, we've had 4 or 5 people asking us to do this, they may slowly start to change their mind, but I don't think it will be a one RFP request. They're all just going to give it. They'll start by saying no, and it just needs to be a pressure of over time of increasing numbers of people requesting the data, and then they will start to see that it is actually quite a priority for a lot of their customers, and that will hopefully start to make business decisions based on their clientele expectations.
I suppose much in the same way that we were saying before about the scope 1 and 2 aspect of speaking to your landlord, those same pressures can be applied. A lot of people are obviously either working from home at the moment, so they're looking to potentially move out of offices or particular buildings, or they're looking at stuff like the EPC changes which are coming about, and they'll say, well, your energy efficiency of this site, your carbon performance of this site isn't actually what we're looking at, so unless you do something to improve it, we'll move. When it comes to suppliers, the exact same thing almost changes. And I think ultimately as well, when this comes to the installation of technologies on the downside, so after everything's set up, they've got a really nice building. For the scoping of new technologies, having that data is really important, especially when looking at something like solar PV.
Yeah, so if you're implementing your solar PV, you would be relating this to your consumption. We don't want to be putting on a massive array that actually you can only use a small portion of it and the rest would be export. Obviously, we have mentioned earlier today about battery usage and the possibilities that can come from that, and also the potential payout from export. But for the best value and for the best usability to ensure no solar electricity goes to waste, it is always best to have a good idea of your energy portfolio, looking at both your consumption but also the daily portfolio of your consumption.
Absolutely. And when we're looking at that daily consumption, that half-hourly data that comes through, it also provides a better business case internally. The more data you get in originally means the better that the proposal being handed to potentially the FD or the CFO will be. They're ultimately potentially going to be the ones that sign off on such a large investment or a long-term investment, that having specific interval data, even at a financial meter level, fiscal meter level, is extremely important. And that also extends to the downside effects of this, the downstream of this, in which there are new schemes now coming about which can be modelled more accurately and provide you with better savings and a better idea of the savings should you have the right metering in place. And as I mentioned before about that wholesale market selling of the energy, we're really starting to see a point in which data quality is extremely important. I think we spoke, I spoke to Benedetta last time on the podcast about the Scope 2 GHG guidance update, which is going to require a lot on the data quality side.
Yeah, so that will be looking at implementing potentially half-hourly time matching. This is something that we are already seeing across the UK, Europe, and US markets, and is likely to start to branch out globally. But currently there is only very small uptake of it because it's so difficult to get the appropriate data. Many companies don't have the appropriate half-hourly meters in place, and as well getting this appropriate information from the generator, matching it up, there is a lot of data that is required which we just don't currently have readily available across an entire portfolio. So if the proposed changes relating to temporality come through as strict as potentially going down to half-hourly data, we will need to see a massive shift in the way that electricity data is stored.
And in turn, in the unbundled procurement of energy attribute certificates, EACs, when looking at procurement of those and setting up a strategy in terms of how you're going to purchase them, how important is data quality in that respect?
So if you were to start hedging without really understanding how much consumption you are procuring, you could be looking at procuring excess certificates, or you could be looking at accidentally under procuring and having to go back to market at a potentially much worse rate, because if you're doing a last minute emergency top up, this will be where there's a much higher demand for certificates across the market. We typically would recommend people only really purchase when they have the highest data quality possible. However, if you want to get ahead of the market and purchase earlier on in the year, there are various different strategies that can be recommended, such as procuring 80% and then doing a later top up. But if you were to at the end not have the sufficient data quality, you would be risking reporting with lower certificates than you would really need to cover your whole portfolio.
Absolutely, and that would actually look at potentially some of the more qualitative aspects of decarbonisation commitments as well. Now, I say qualitative, I mean normally you see them in reports where people say we're procuring 100% green electricity, and that scramble that will come about at the very end is definitely something that we obviously advise clients against, and we actually try and reassure them that actually we can support and and getting those EACs procured in the most appropriate manner, and making sure that on the financial aspect they're hopefully going to get the highest quality product for whatever they're paying. And lastly, I want to touch on this decarbonisation aspect and the longer term effects of this. So we were discussing just now about the unbundled procurement approach and how really the financial oversight and the consumption oversight is really important to have. What sort of effects do you really expect to see in the future if people start to put off on their data quality oversight?
So the first really big risk is companies who have been relying on financial and estimated data for a long time, finding when they do eventually go down to a product level data, potentially for their Scope 3 upstream categories, that they actually were quite significantly off with their estimations. You see there's limitations with financial data where if you're looking to buy more sustainable, high quality product, this will have potentially higher costs associated with it. And so if you're using financial data, you're going to have higher emissions associated with that than the less sustainable, lower cost product. So if you are relying too much on that data source, you could find when you do move on to having product level data or actually good quality data that there has been a significant shift in your methodology that could either significantly inflate or deflate your footprint. If this inflation or change has been over a significance threshold, then companies might have to start looking at backdating their baseline emissions and recalculating to ensure that the methodologies align. And that's a lot of additional work in the future with data sets that were probably not really there to begin with, but it could be required for certain compliance schemes to ensure that people are having comparable footprints over time. Additionally, as mentioned with fugitive emissions, if you don't have the data quality, you can't really take any actions. If you're using estimations or if you're using financial information, kind of going back to that same example of the more sustainable product costs more, if you were to make sustainable changes in your Scope 3 by looking at a low waste ethical product that has got a higher cost associated with it for that reason, you would, using a financial data set, end up with a increase in your carbon footprint. Whereas if you were to use a granular product level data, you would in turn see a decrease in your footprint. So I would just be hesitant to rely too much on low quality data, as could be concerned that this might lead to companies avoiding making sustainable changes if they're seeing that, that company's got a higher carbon footprint than the previous company, but it doesn't. You just have a higher cost associated with that company.
And I think, as you were saying on that, you think you'd really struggle to find any business out there who is using product-specific information. And as you mentioned, when it comes to that longer-term planning, you may have to reset your targets, and also actually marketing what you've got becomes a lot more difficult over obviously the fear of greenwashing, etc. But thank you very much for talking to me today about decarbonisation on the supply chain and obviously the data quality impacts. It's been really interesting to speak to you.
Okay, yes, thank you. Of course, it was lovely to come and join you today.
And in the future for NUS Now, we are going to be looking at speaking to some suppliers, whether that be on the EACs or in the general energy market. But for now, thank you for listening, and we'll speak soon.